Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Handling Suspected Fraud and Data Fabrication in Clinical Studies, presented by Rowe. I'm Joe Keenan, contributing editor to Fierce Markets, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speaker today is Lisa Triantafilo, Director of Quality Assurance at Rowe. You can read her full bio on the right side of your window. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Resources List button at the bottom of your screen. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help button at the bottom of your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentation with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the left side of your screen, and you can do that throughout the presentation. I think we're ready to begin. Lisa, please go ahead.
Thank you. So today we're going to talk about detecting, handling, and reporting data falsification, misconduct, and suspected fraud. And we're not going to just do a training on how to detect fraud. We want to focus on how we proceduralize all aspects of dealing with misconduct and data fabrication. So we're going to present this information in terms of how an SOP on this topic would look. So the purpose and scope here is presented to you not only on what we're going to cover in the material, but the purpose and scope of a procedure that would cover this. So basically, you want to have a procedure at your company that governs how staff detect, handle, and report misconduct, and then also how you handle that when it is reported. So let's first just talk about terminology. There are differences in these terms, and we want to focus on those initially. Data falsification and fabrication is sort of a broad term that includes creating, altering, recording, or omitting data in such a way that the data don't represent what actually occurred. This could be the result of misconduct or fraud, and it also could be accidental or the result of sloppiness. When we talk about misconduct specifically, when we look to the regulations, we see the terms serious or continuing misconduct or serious or continuing noncompliance. So misconduct is that it's a serious or repetitive failure to comply with good clinical practice and the regulatory requirements and other applicable standards. Again, this could result in false data, sometimes owing to a lack of understanding or the consequences of falsification, could result from just an inattention to detail, inadequate staffing, or lack of supervision. It may be unintentional, it may be intentional, but if unintentional, it would not be done to deliberately deceive, but it still could place the safety of the subjects at risk or jeopardize the reliability of the data. When we talk about fraud specifically, this is a legal term. Typically, it is defined as providing, misrepresenting, or concealing a statement of material fact with the intent to deceive. When we see it referenced in regulatory references, we typically see the words willfully and knowingly. So this is something that's done on purpose and typically done more than once to meet the legal definition of fraud. This is probably the last time we'll talk about fraud specifically, because what we are trying to cover today and what your SOP should cover is any sort of misconduct or fabrication. You don't want to wait until a determination of fraud is made to handle it. That's typically the outcome of the investigation. Some of the items that are most commonly falsified include standardized medical report outputs such as ECGs, blood pressure data that are recorded or other vital signs, results from physical examinations, sometimes biological specimens themselves are falsified, Subject IDs are another area, as well as investigational product compliance records. Again, we're going to talk about how we would proceduralize the detection, reporting, and handling of falsification and misconduct. And so we want to make sure we focus on the various responsibilities, as each group or individual will have possibly different responsibilities with respect to this. So your procedure should cover all employees, contractors, consultants, or subcontractors who have access to data or would be in a position to detect fabrication or misconduct, or if they're one of the people who are charged with investigating it or reporting it. Your supervisors, field trainers, and mentors as well would be in a position to advise monitoring staff or to assess the reports. Your project leaders and lead CRAs will be in a position of receiving the reports and having to assess them and handle them. Your quality assurance unit obviously will need to be involved in the escalation of issues that could be misconduct. Your sector leaders or senior management, however your organization is set up, those people obviously will be in the escalation path. And at times, your human resources or ethics officer may be involved if the misconduct involves any of your own staff. So let's talk about detection. So basically, in addition to the activities outlined for individuals, you have your procedural documents, your study-specific plans that tell everybody what they ought to be doing. In addition to just doing their jobs, employees should be vigilant for signs of data falsification, misconduct, and/or suspected fraud. So even though you may have an individual or separate procedure for this, employees should be reminded that it should be built into all aspects of their jobs. When we talk about data falsification, typically falsification falls into one of three categories. So these types are omitted data, altered data, and data that are manufactured. We're going to go through each of these and discuss some common examples. When we talk about omitted data, obviously those are data that exist but are not revealed or reported. This can be consciously underreporting or inadvertent underreporting. Some examples typically of omitted data are adverse events and concomitant medications. We're going to go through some examples from real-life audits momentarily where we'll discuss how these two types of events are most commonly omitted. Things to be on the lookout for: if your investigator or their designee doesn't make all the participant medical records available for monitoring and/or inspection, very often omitted data is common when there's the use of shadow charts. The second type of falsification is altered data. This is where the data exists, but then they are consciously manipulated or changed. Some examples are altering laboratory reports or study-specific test results, or changing a test date or a patient identifier. One example of this would be if there was a study requirement for a normal ECG report to be eligible to enroll a participant, and an investigator took an ECG report and modified or falsified participant identifiers to make it appear that a report belonged to a participant to whom it did not belong. So this would be a legitimately obtained report, but then falsified or altered to apply to someone else or to another date. Things to be on the lookout for: of course, unjustified changes to important data, late entries not fully explained, alterations to lab reports, or other printouts from electronic systems. And we're going to go more into methods for avoiding this or dealing with it when it is encountered. The third type of falsified data are manufactured data. This is when data do not exist or assessments were not done, and yet the data are created and reported. So fabricating information or creating results without performing the work. Some examples are obviously filling in values in the case report form for which no data were obtained, photocopying data from one patient to another, or creating fictitious subjects altogether. Things to be on the lookout for would be inconsistent source documentation practices, and we'll discuss this in a bit more detail. Be on the lookout for suspicious signatures or sharing of electronic signature components. Be on the lookout for suspicious handwriting or inconsistent handwriting, any total obliteration of subject IDs, dates of birth, visit or test dates, or any other data. Specifically, when we look at fabricated signatures, we could see those in a paper environment or an electronic environment. In a paper environment, be on the lookout for signatures that are dissimilar because they could be forged by another person. And sometimes signatures that are too similar because these are sometimes copied and the image then traced or scanned from authentic signatures and placed on other documents. With respect to non-standard signatures or non-paper signatures, very few people utilize a signature stamp these days, but I do still see it occasionally. And you would want to know what is their procedure for the use of such a stamp and what controls are in place to prevent its abuse or use by another person. Likewise, when we deal with signatures in an electronic environment, we want to verify that passwords are not shared because basically that is the equivalent of handwriting a signature on behalf of another person. Signing for someone else is never acceptable. You want to also know what does a signature mean because sometimes that might explain why others might be signing for individuals. When we look at the regulations and good clinical practices, it tells us that all documentation associated with a clinical study should be attributable and contemporaneous. So that's typically interpreted to mean that signatures should have a date applied by the individual signing or by an audit trail if it's an electronic signature. So when seeing and reviewing handwritten signatures, you typically should see that a handwritten date is personally applied by the person signing the document. Backdating is never acceptable in our industry, so all documents should be dated contemporaneously. So now let's talk about how we detect fabrication and potential fraud. One of the main things that's important when you're a CRA and you're going to the site to verify the data, you want to make sure that you first understand what is the site's normal record-keeping practice, and then how is that supplemented or augmented potentially to meet the needs of the study protocol. You want to identify locations for all original source data and verify their existence at each visit. And you want to verify that CRF data are supported by original source data. If study-specific charts, also known as shadow charts, are maintained in addition to the standard record-keeping practices at the site, then all the records supporting the data collected in the study-specific chart must be assessed and monitored. In some cases, you may want to establish a procedure with the site at the point of study initiation to determine how this would be done. It's very important that the site understand what the monitor will be looking at each time. And often if they establish a shadow chart, they assume that that's all they'll need to produce during the monitoring visits. It's important that they understand that they need to make all documentation available regularly or implement a process whereby there is a QC, a documented QC from the shadow chart to its sources. So when the CRA is on site, obviously they should inventory all source records and determine if any records are missing. This is facilitated nicely if you create some sort of a source data map when you first get involved with the study at the site. You want to understand what is the standard record-keeping practice, how's that been augmented for the study, what documentation will be available at each visit. And then when you get that information at the beginning of the visit, inventory it, determine what is missing, and then ask for the other documentation. A CRA should notify their project manager or lead CRA immediately if any records are missing or appear to be missing, and repeated attempts to obtain the missing records go unsuccessful. So then what are some of the possible signs of fraud and fabricated data? And again, we'll look at some specific examples to sort of drive these points home. One of the things, of course, is missing or incomplete source documents. Nothing tells me something's up quicker than if I see data in a database and I see some source document worksheet with blanks where those data would have been first reported. That tells me there must be some other source for that information for it to make it into the database without being on that worksheet. Also, use of whiteout on a paper system or any other forms of obliteration of data or frequent corrections to the source documentation. If you're at a site one visit and information is there that you monitor and you go back the next time and some of that information is unavailable, you'll want to question what their processes are and how information can be removed without an audit trail of where the information went. Anytime you see total obliteration of a subject ID on a medical record or a test, that is certainly something to challenge. If you see significantly more or fewer screen failures or early terminations at a site than other sites, again, look into what might be going on at that site. If you see fewer adverse events, concomitant medications, and physical exam findings at a site than other sites, again, question, do they understand the reporting requirements? Are they doing it properly, or could something be going on where they are purposefully or inadvertently underreporting? If you have a site that is completely compliant with the protocol and the event schedule within the protocol, look a little deeper to see if they are truly reporting everything as it occurs. If you have greater than average occurrence of laboratory sample issues, it might be possible that there's something that they're trying to hide. Perhaps this is one of the indications that subjects may not even exist if it's hard to get a specimen on a participant. And then where there are diary cards that are handwritten. Again, most of these are done electronically these days, but when you have handwritten documents that are completed by participants, you want to compare the handwriting on those materials with other information in the chart to see if the handwriting appears to be the same or similar as the participant. And then you want to look at those cards with respect to their quality to see if they might appear to be completed all at once, or if they're in pristine condition, indicating that they would not have normal wear and tear that would be expected. Sometimes if the same color of ink or the same pen is used and maybe the handwriting all appears to be in the same slant, it might indicate that the diaries were completed in a batch all at once instead of in real time as the study protocol might require. Look and see if you have a lot of subject visits on the same day, and determine if your site can accommodate that, if it makes sense. Look at those dates of visits to determine, did they occur on holidays, weekends, or dates on which the key staff were known to be away from the clinic? We'll discuss a specific example where this came into play. Look at the handwriting again and see, did similar handwriting appear to have been used across consent forms or between subjects and another person and the person obtaining consent? Check to see if your informed consent form signatures match other documents in the medical records, such as insurance forms or release forms, or maybe even those diaries. We've discussed handwriting on the diaries or quality of life questionnaires and checking to see, does it vary greatly from visit to visit, or is it different from the informed consent document? These days, we're doing more and more centralized data monitoring and involving our data management and our statistical staff in the assessment of data. And so very often, either the CRA or one of these remote data monitors will pick up trends in the data that make it appear not to be real. Sometimes there might be subjects at a site who are too similar or too average, or we see favorite numbers used too frequently, such as a blood pressure of 120/80 or a standard pulse of 72. Maybe we see these the same across visit to visit, knowing that they would not be identical at every visit, but would have some variance. Or maybe we would see that it's always only even numbers. Sometimes we might see similar number of concomitant medications or medical history conditions or adverse events for subjects. And sometimes these are actually patterns or trends that we can pick up through a visual review, and often they are only detected in a data review. And what if we see a site where subjects follow a predictable rate of improvement? Again, something to question. It's important to note, though, that no one of these occurrences proves there's misconduct at a trial site. But observance of these occurrences should be documented and investigated to ensure that no misconduct is taking place. The clinical monitor in particular, being the person who visits the trial site and sees the source data, should show due diligence by being aware of signs of possible fraud and fabricated data during each and every monitoring visit. And when you write your procedures, you want to make sure that you cover the signs of possible fraud and fabricated data, that these are detected during the monitoring visits, and that your procedure includes these steps. The monitor should never take no for an answer with regard to access to source records. If upon initiation you establish a source monitoring plan or a source data map, then the monitor should hold the investigator site accountable to that plan and should question when what is seen at the visit is different from what was indicated in the plan. The monitor should read and evaluate all source notes and test results. Don't just inventory the source documents. Each document should be reviewed with respect to its legitimacy. Was it obtained properly? Does the documentation indicate that it is legitimate? The monitor should always question when standard record-keeping practices are not followed. If the monitor is used to seeing concomitant meds in a particular place and sees them in a different place, then the monitor should question that, because it could be that the source data plan as first described is not adequate and would need to change. The monitor should question missing dates, times, and information, and question the source when missing information is added. I've seen queries to the site that says, monitor introduced queries that say no source for this data. Please add to the source document worksheet. Obviously, that would not be the way to do it. You would question, how do you have these data in your system if you don't have any source documentation for them? What was the process for obtaining the data, and where were the data first recorded? And then when data are added, to address those questions, the monitor should question from where the data were obtained. Was new information gathered, or was the information gathered previously but not documented? And explanations should be provided that make sense and are consistent with what the monitor sees. And of course, the monitor should always question inconsistencies in dates, handwriting, and signatures. Now, the monitor deals in facts at the site, not feelings. And so sometimes they're going to see things that alarm them, and they're going to need to gather objective information and document their concerns objectively within their monitoring visit reports. And when they escalate to their management, they want to provide only objective information. However, sharing feelings of concern is important as well, because not all things can be confirmed by the monitor and may require additional actions such as site audits or further communications by senior management. So let's look at some examples. The examples I'm providing for you today are from a paper-based system. The first set are from a paper-based system, because this is easier to visualize at this point, or to provide examples than from an electronic medical record system. But the concept is the same. In this situation, we had a site who was providing only shadow charts to their CRA. The CRA had a gut feeling that something wasn't right at the site, but they could not confirm that because when they reviewed the source documentation, it supported the entries in the database and indicated that the participants and the investigator were following the protocol. So because of the gut feeling of the monitor, that was escalated within the organization, and the determination was made to send an auditor to the site to do a GCP audit to determine if the monitor's concerns were real. Initially, this audit I did myself. So initially, I arrived at the site, and to determine the standard record-keeping practices at the site, I asked some questions and determined that 5 of the 7 participants at the site were clinic patients there, and 2 were recruited through advertisements. So I realized that because 5 were clinic patients, I should see clinic charts for those 5 and not just the study-specific shadow charts. So of a 3-day audit, I spent the first 2 days asking for the medical records charts, the clinic charts, and being declined by various staff members. So the morning of the 3rd day, I insisted that if I did not receive those original charts, I would just have to close the audit and list them as being non-compliant and uncooperative. So one of the staff members brought me the medical charts. So once I was able to see the chart, I was able to determine that indeed the monitor's concerns were real, because the information being reported in the shadow charts was highly inconsistent with the information in the clinic charts. So the examples that are provided to you are labeled because they're a set. So this is A2. This is a progress note that was in the original, the shadow chart for this participant. So I was able to confirm the initials and the birth date, and there was other information on this form to clearly connect it with the medical chart that I received. However, that was about all of the information that was consistent. So, so we see highlighted in yellow, we see the patient is doing okay, doing well, no complaints to offer. That's highlighted in yellow. And then in orange, we have the PE performed by the investigator. This is the PE form, the physical examination form from the shadow chart. And we can see that all areas of the body were indicated as normal and one was not done. And then this document is the actual medical chart. So this is a physical exam form that is from the medical chart for this participant. And we see that not all items are indicated as normal. So in orange, I'm highlighting the abnormal physical findings. In yellow, we have adverse events. So there are numerous issues documented on the clinical chart, and yet all we got in the medical record, in the shadow chart, was doing well, no complaints to offer. We also see that there are concomitant medications that were prescribed at this visit, and yet none of that was reported in the shadow chart. Likewise, we have another set for another participant at this site. There is a mention of diarrhea, that concern is still open, but other than that, no complaints. In this case, we have a study visit date on one side of a clinic visit and a study visit date on another side of a clinic visit. The actual clinic visit occurred on a date that was neither of those study visit dates. What we determined was that the study visits did not really occur. This person was a patient at the clinic and did indeed come in periodically for clinic visits, but never actually came in for a study visit. And we were only able to determine that by gaining access to the original source documentation. And these all follow a similar pattern. So if we think about that in terms of electronic systems today, what we typically see, or what I see more often than I would like, is that the site's standard record-keeping practices involve the use of an electronic medical records system. But that system does not easily facilitate, or does not at all facilitate, granting limited access to external users such as monitors. And so the site will say, I'm sorry, we can't give you access to our system, so we'll just print out what you need and we'll give you that to monitor. And sometimes that works out well if the site has an adequate process for reviewing all of their electronic medical records, extracting information for a participant, and then QCing that documentation to verify that it is a complete and accurate representation of that participant's experience on the study. However, sometimes that doesn't happen, and important information that's in that electronic medical record system never makes it into the study database because it's not extracted and the monitors are not aware that it's there. Again, most commonly, we see adverse events and concomitant medications falling into the underreported categories when the shadow chart system is used. I also want to provide some examples from a warning letter. This is a situation where there was a study, it's a pretty high-profile study actually, and the CRO and the monitors and all the folks at the CRO did a good job of detecting issues that were important, escalating them appropriately, and documenting them. Unfortunately, in this example, the sponsor did not take the concerns seriously and did not resolve them and ended up receiving a warning letter and a clinical hold on their product. So while these are not copies of original sources. These are excerpts from the warning letter that I think are very informative. So one of the things that they say, review of the monitoring records and the quality assurance audit records and email communications between the CRO and the sponsor disclosed that the sponsor knew of pervasive problems at the clinical investigator site. So that tells us that the monitors detected issues, escalated them appropriately, quality assurance was involved, and everything was documented. But their review found that the CRO identified significant problems at an investigator site and subsequently informed the sponsor of the findings. But the FDA noted that the sponsor failed to promptly secure compliance from the site and did not adequately investigate allegations of fraud. So I wanted to point that out because not a lot of warning letters specifically mention fraud. And this is one where we see that the FDA has concluded there was fraud. There were even some criminal prosecutions because of this study. So what things did they see that they determined were fraud? The monitors noted that the study coordinator dated the informed consent document for several subjects and dated all informed consent documents for the investigator. There were overwrites on several subjects' signature dates. Thus, the actual date the subject signed the consent document wasn't clear. For several subjects, either the initials on each page of the document did not match or the initials had not been placed on the pages of the consent. So you can see these are things that you might encounter every now and then, one or two of these, but we see them in large volume on this study, and so the determination was made that it was misconduct. The CRO noted that the signature of one subject didn't match the signature in a medical chart, and the monitoring report noted that the signature on the informed consent document appeared to match the study coordinator's handwriting. So again, the monitor detected something concerning and documented it objectively in the monitoring visit report and then escalated it. One of the findings from this warning letter tells us that an investigator did not even have written informed consent documentation for 30 participants. And that investigator's explanation to the CRO, to the monitor, was simply that verbal consent was obtained from these participants. Other examples from this warning letter of problems they saw at the site: medical records didn't provide sufficient information. There was a lack of source documentation to even verify that the participants had the disease under study and should have met entry criteria. The monitors identified several subjects who had been enrolled, even though they had conditions that should have excluded them. And a large number of participants were randomized in short increments of time, with most occurring when the office was closed for lunch and not seeing patients. So this goes back to a point that we made earlier. Pay attention to the dates when participants are seen. Note if large groups of them come in on certain days, and note if those dates coincide with closings or when key staff are unavailable. There were also lab values for multiple subjects that were suspiciously similar. It was determined later that the investigator was providing her own specimens for some of the participants. This one's alarming. The auditor noted that the site did not know the definition and reporting requirements of adverse events of significant interest and serious adverse events. And even more alarming, adverse events were not reported for the first 360 participants at one particular site. And then the monitor noted that adverse events reported for subsequent subjects were only of 4 types. and most were filled out in a different colored ink at visit 2. So these are all things that were clearly triggers of falsification. Okay, so we have to train our staff how to detect falsification and misconduct during their routine activities. And we have to have procedures in place to assure they know that and that they know what to do when they encounter these. So this section of the presentation is geared toward talking about how we handle these and how we report them. This is applicable to all staff, not just those who are present at the site. So an adequate procedure would have the person who suspects misconduct to immediately report those suspicions to their supervisor, to their lead CRA, but without alerting suspicion of the suspected person. You want to ask objective questions to gain evidence or to at least clarify what's going on, but the monitor or the person interacting with the suspected person would never make accusations or indicate that we were concerned about fabrication. And then that person who suspects the misconduct would ensure that all of the documentation is escalated appropriately in accordance with the applicable procedure, and this typically would involve escalating the issues to quality assurance. If the suspected person's an employee, obviously your quality assurance unit is not as well equipped to handle that as your HR department or your ethics officer. So then the monitor would notify, of course, the lead CRA or supervisor prior to the end of the current monitoring visit. And then the suspicion should be explained and supporting documentation should be provided. It's very important to gather as much objective evidence as possible to support claims or suspicions of misconduct. The examples that I showed you earlier, I was able to obtain copies with permission from the site. You probably don't want to ask the smartest person at the site for permission to copy these types of records, but you do want to get permission before you make copies. And of course, you want to observe all of your privacy and confidentiality rules with respect to participant identifiers, PHI and PII. Again, don't confront the investigator with the suspicions. An accusation of research misconduct is very serious, and a full investigation should be conducted before involving the PI. The monitor should ensure all deviations from federal regulations and guidelines are documented and explained by the investigator and reported in the monitoring visit report. That's what they do normally. They're always going to detect some minor issues. All of those should be documented. And then further, they should ensure that any observations of possible fraud or fabrication or misconduct are escalated. So document the individual deviations, provide objective evidence when possible, and then ensure the escalation, the prompt escalation of issues of concern. When reports are made to the lead CRA, the project leader, supervisor, or other, it's important that the procedure mandate that all of these types of complaints and concerns are deemed credible and investigated in a timely manner. And the procedure should ensure that all issues that are raised are followed to a documented closure. From a quality assurance perspective, when complaints of possible misconduct are received, the head of QA or their designee should call a meeting to discuss the allegations and to review the objective evidence that's available. And then once they've met and reviewed the information, they'll work with the project leader or lead CRA or other to ensure that an action plan is developed. And that action plan, you want to identify the level of an impact or potential impact or risk associated with the misconduct and determine the type of follow-up activities that need to occur. And those might include a for-cause audit, sponsor notification if you're the CRO that has detected the issue. And of course, it might even involve regulatory authority reporting. The FDA regulations mandate that serious or continuing noncompliance be promptly reported to the IRB and to the FDA. And of course, if a site is suspended or terminated for misconduct, that also requires prompt reporting. It's very important that all decisions arising from review meetings are documented by QA, and that QA escalate or inform the leadership group of misconduct and the action plan. It should be up to QA to verify that all actions in the agreed upon action plan have been completed. Your operational management is responsible for following up on the actions and ensuring that the agreed upon plan is implemented and interacting with the sponsor to secure agreement on the plan for action. Again, all complaints and investigations of data falsification, misconduct, and suspected fraud should be documented in writing. There are differences of opinion on where that documentation should be maintained. There is a section in the DIA model for most eTMF systems for quality assurance documentation and CAPA plans. Many people feel like it's perfectly appropriate to put the information in there so that it's available to all. There are times, however, when documentation is more appropriately held in an internal file, but still made available if requested or needed during an audit or inspection. In closing, I wanted to give you this one additional example. This is a very astute monitor who detected that something wasn't quite right. This monitor was a friend of mine and went to do just routine drug accountability verification. And this was a study where it was a topical solution, a topical ointment, the investigational product. And when this person went to do the accountability, after reviewing several vials noted, or tubes noted, that they all appeared to have been squeezed by the same person, the same size hand, in the same manner. And clearly, when the tubes were lined up, it does indicate that there was a pattern. And after further investigation, it was true that these tubes had not really been dispensed to participants, but they had been squeezed to make them look like some of the product had been used. So this was a very astute monitor who detected this situation. So that's it for the content of the talk. And so now we will open the floor to questions and comments. We welcome any of you who have real-life experiences you would like to share, as well as questions about detecting, handling, or reporting fabrication, misconduct, and fraud.
All right, Lisa, thank you, and we'll move on to the Q&A. Just a reminder to the audience that there's still time to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many as possible, even though we're a little tight on time. So, Lisa, first question up is, what if I raise concerns to my manager and they don't take action?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think it's really important that we pay attention to the job that we're assigned. And so SOPs or other procedural documents and monitoring plans, when they talk about the detection and reporting and handling of fabrication and misconduct, they should be clear about responsibilities. Who is responsible for what? Very often the CRA is the only person who actually is at the site to see the source and the reported data in the database, so they're best positioned to detect the problems. However, it's not the CRA's responsibility to bring the site into compliance all by themselves. So the FDA mandates that when a site exhibits serious or continuing noncompliance, the sponsor promptly secure compliance or discontinue investigational product to the drug, basically close out the site. So your procedure should be clear in the steps that are taken between the CRA detecting, reporting, and escalating to management evaluating and determining a plan for action and the sponsor's plan to bring the site into compliance or to close them. And sometimes, unfortunately, the outcome at the end is not what the CRA might want it to be. The examples I used from the warning letter, again, go to the heart of that problem, but demonstrate a situation where the monitor did everything the monitor should do and escalated and documented the issues appropriately. However, the sponsor did not act accordingly, and the issue became problematic, obviously, during the FDA inspections. So I guess the take-home message is be sure you do your job well, hand it off to the next responsible person, and then unfortunately, that's probably where your responsibility and ability to control ends.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Next question up, audience member says that sometimes when they cross-check signatures, giving the example of ICF and check-in forms, that subjects actually sign in different ways, particularly younger participants who are just establishing their signature. Since this audience member says they're dealing with bioequivalent studies and they are present on studies as monitors and ask the subject to make correction, is that sufficient, or should they do some more detailed note about such cases?
Thank you. That's a good question. I think it's a good reminder that no one problem is indicative of misconduct at a site. And in the example given, it appears that they are able to confirm by actually being on site and verifying visually that the participants exist and are documenting that those signature inconsistencies do not indicate misconduct, but there's another root cause, such as young people establishing signatures, or I've even seen situations where the position of the person at the time would change how their signature appears. So I think, in that case, as a monitor, I would want to see documentation that the monitor noted that there were signature inconsistencies, questioned the site, and the explanation was provided, and that the monitor verified whatever they could verify and found the response or the explanation to be acceptable. I think it's important to always document what is observed and what might appear to be concerning to another person who would view it after the monitor, right? So if the monitor sees something that they feel someone else would question, even if they investigate it and find it not to be problematic, it's a good idea to document that investigation and outcome so that the next person doesn't have to question it again.
All right, Lisa, are you seeing any particular trends in frauds? And for example, geography-wise, are you seeing more in or outside of the U.S. versus other regions like Asia Pacific, Western or Eastern Europe?
I think it's two questions. So the first thing is trends. So I think trends as far as fabrication or falsification, the biggest trends I'm seeing is with respect to the use of shadow charts with electronic medical records. I'm seeing underreporting of adverse events and concomitant medications. With respect to the U.S. or elsewhere, my personal experience is that I find more issues probably in Asia and India than other regions. And I think it might be cultural because of how people view questioning authority or asking questions in general versus looking like, they know what they're doing. Sometimes people don't ask questions and they'll answer something without knowing, or they'll fear challenging authority, and even if they see something that doesn't look right, they might not challenge it because of the authority.
All right, Lisa, given time, this looks like this will be our last question. What is the most identified reason for fraud?
That's a tough one because, you know, we don't always get to assess the root cause of fraud. But I'd say from the information that I've been exposed to in my own personal experiences, it's typically greed. I've seen more fabrication to increase subject enrollment, therefore to increase the payments that they receive. The first set of examples I gave with the paper records and the shadow charts, those participants, those were real people at that clinic, but they were never actually on the study. They were never exposed to the investigational product, and the root cause of that seemed to just be greed, where they were just the site was taking on as many studies as they could do, and then they had this little sort of backroom process for fabricating records so that they could get paid for those participants. So I think out of the real fraud, where we're really saying it's legally, you know, meets the definition of fraud, where it's willingly and knowingly misrepresenting, I think greed is the root cause.
Okay, and that wraps up our Q&A session. I'd like to thank the audience for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd also like to thank our speaker for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. A reminder, the webinar has been recorded, and you will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.